Before the rush of the world begins, before the noise of traffic, the endless pings of your phone, and the weight of unfinished tasks, there is a rare, fragile moment. The very first breath of your morning. Most people let it pass unnoticed. They wake up already lost in thought, their mind racing ahead to the day's worries. But in Zen, this moment holds the key to shaping your entire day, and perhaps your entire life. Imagine, instead of being dragged into the day like a leaf caught in a storm, you rise with the calm authority of the ocean itself. Your mind steady, your body light, your heart open. It starts with something so simple yet so powerful that we've forgotten how to truly do it: breathing. When your eyes open, don't rush. Let your awareness settle into your body. Feel the warmth of your bed, the rise and fall of your chest. Notice the faint rhythm of your heartbeat, your oldest, most faithful companion. Before you even move, offer gratitude. Not as words, but as a deep inner acknowledgement. I am here. I am alive. Sit up slowly. Place your feet on the floor and feel the coolness beneath your skin. This is not just waking up, it's arriving in the present moment. Now take one slow breath in, hold it, and let it go, releasing the stiffness of sleep. This is your silent promise to yourself. Today, I will not rush blindly through my hours. You may notice the sunlight spilling across the room, the way the air feels on your skin. These small details, so ordinary, become extraordinary when you meet them with full awareness. Zen teaches that life is not hidden in faraway moments or big achievements. It is always here in the quiet touch of reality against your senses. And so, your morning becomes a ritual, not a routine. Maybe you drink tea, feeling its warmth as if holding a small sun in your hands. Maybe you stretch, letting your muscles awaken like flowers opening at dawn. Whatever you do it with one undivided mind. In this stillness, the world is not yet asking anything of you. You're not chasing, not resisting, just being. And in that space, something subtle begins to happen. Your thoughts soften, your breathing deepens, and you feel an unshakable sense of enoughness. That is the seed you plant at dawn, the seed of peace, that will grow quietly through your day. And as the sun climbs higher, you carry this grounded awareness forward, letting it touch everything you do, like a gentle undercurrent guiding your steps. Because when the day is born in mindfulness, the rest of the day knows how to follow. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you notice a thought rising in your mind. It might be something small, like I forgot to reply to that email, or it might be something heavy, like I'll never be good enough. Most of us don't pause there. We immediately get swept away, chasing that thought, defending it, fighting it, feeding it. We wear it like an identity. But here's the truth most people never hear in their entire life. You are not your thoughts. Imagine your mind as a vast blue sky. Your thoughts are clouds drifting through it, some light and fluffy, others dark and stormy. They come, they go, they change shape, but the sky is untouched. It doesn't become angry when a storm cloud passes, and it doesn't become joyful when the sun breaks through. It simply holds everything in perfect stillness. When you realize this, something changes. Suddenly, that voice in your head, the one that constantly comments, criticizes, remembers, and predicts, loses its power. It's not you, it's just mental weather. The Buddha once said, your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own unguarded thoughts. But here's the key: if you are not your thoughts, they can't actually harm you. They can only harm the identity you've mistaken for yourself. So how do you step out of the storm and into the sky? It begins with awareness, not forcing thoughts to stop. That's like trying to push clouds out of the sky with your hands. Instead, you watch them. You let them pass without judgment, without grabbing onto them. The more you practice, the more you notice something astonishing. There is a deep, unshakable stillness underneath all the noise. A silence that has been with you since the day you were born. That is the real you, not the anxious voice, not the triumphant one either. Just the presence that watches it all. And when you live from that stillness, life changes. Stress no longer sticks to you. Insults dissolve before they can wound. Success doesn't inflate your ego because you know it's just another passing cloud. You begin to move through the world lighter, freer, more awake. because you're no longer tangled in the weather of your mind. You've come home to the sky. There's a quiet truth most of us overlook, a truth so simple it almost feels impossible. We spend years searching, chasing, grasping, convinced that happiness, peace, or meaning will be found out there, somewhere beyond ourselves. We wait for the right person, the right job, the right place, the right time, like wanderers in an endless desert, always hoping the next horizon will finally quench our thirst. But what if we've been holding the water all along? Close your eyes for a moment. Feel your breath as it enters and leaves. Beneath all the noise, the opinions of others, the pressures of life, the voices in your head telling you what you lack, there is a stillness that has been here since the very beginning. That stillness is not empty, it is full of everything you have been searching for. You see, the mind is an expert at convincing us that we are incomplete, that we are missing something vital. And so, we go looking in relationships, in possessions, in titles, in the approval of strangers. But the more we chase, the further away the truth seems to get. The truth is, you were born whole. You already carry the seeds of peace, strength, and joy within you. They are not gifts you have to earn, they are your birthright. When a flower blooms, it does not run around asking for petals. When a star shines, it does not search for light. And yet, we humans, in our forgetting, beg the world to complete us, never realizing we are already complete. The moment you turn inward, not in escape from life, but in deep presence with it, you begin to see the wealth you already possess. The warmth of gratitude, the courage to face uncertainty, the freedom of not needing to prove yourself. Imagine living with that awareness, waking each day not in scarcity, but in abundance, not in the desperate hope that today will finally bring you what you lack, but in the quiet knowing that nothing is missing, that whatever the day brings, you already have what it takes to meet it. This doesn't mean life will never hurt you. It means you will not be defined by the hurt. You will know how to return again and again to that inner space no storm can touch. And in that space, something beautiful happens. You stop chasing. You start living. Because when you know that everything you need is already within you, the world is no longer a place you must conquer. It becomes a place you can simply be. There's a quiet power in realizing that no one and nothing outside of you has the authority to shake your inner calm, unless you hand them the keys. Think about it. How many times have you felt peaceful, only for a single comment, a bad headline, or an unexpected change of plans to set your mind spinning? It's almost as if we've been trained to believe that peace is something fragile, something easily stolen. But what if peace is not a glass ornament the world can shatter, but an unshakable mountain rooted deep inside your being? The truth is, disturbances don't actually enter from the outside, they rise from within. A storm doesn't begin because the wind blows. It begins because we let the wind control the sails of our mind. When someone criticizes us, it's not their words that truly hurt. It's the stories we tell ourselves about those words. When a challenge appears, it's not the challenge itself that robs us of peace, it's the way we decide to meet it. I remember a Zen master once asked his students, "If a bell makes no sound unless struck, can you be silent when struck by life?" The lesson wasn't about suppression. It was about sovereignty, the power to choose your response. The master explained that a bell does not decide when it is struck. But you are not a bell. You are a conscious being who can decide whether to ring in anger or remain in stillness. In a world obsessed with control, here's the irony. True control is not about manipulating people, events, or circumstances. True control is choosing not to be controlled by them. And this is not some mystical gift reserved for monks in distant mountains. It's a skill anyone can cultivate. It starts with awareness. Awareness of the tiny moment between stimulus and response. That pause, that breath, is where your freedom lies. When life tests you, you will be tempted to think, if only they changed, if only this situation were different, I'd feel calm again. But that thinking turns you into a hostage of the outside world. Peace cannot depend on the mood of another person or the chaos of the day. Peace is yours when you stop outsourcing your happiness to things beyond your reach. So, The next time someone tries to drag you into their storm, remember you don't have to step in. Let their storm stay theirs. Stand firm in your own clear sky, because the moment you realize that nothing outside of you can disturb your peace, the world loses its power to shake you, and you finally see that the calm you were chasing was never out there at all. It was always here. There's a strange thing about the human mind. It's always racing ahead, isn't it? Even when our bodies are right here, sitting in this chair, our minds are already living in 100 possible futures, some exciting, some terrifying, all pulling us away from this moment. We call it being productive. We call it planning ahead. But if we're honest, a lot of the time it's just pressure. The pressure to be more, to achieve more, to prove something to ourselves, to others, to the invisible scoreboard we think the world is keeping. And yet, here's the quiet truth most people don't want to face. Pressure doesn't make life deeper. It just makes it heavier. Presence. Now that's where life actually happens. When you choose presence over pressure, you realize something beautiful. You don't need to constantly be on to live a meaningful life. You can pause without falling behind. You can rest without becoming lazy. You can breathe without losing your edge. Think about it. The most unforgettable moments in life, the ones you carry in your heart, they weren't planned down to the second, were they? They happened when you were truly there, when you laughed without checking your phone, when you listened without already thinking of your reply, when you felt the warmth of the sun and actually let yourself feel it. The Buddhist masters have always pointed to this. They remind us that the present moment is complete. It doesn't need your improvement. It only needs your attention. But here's the tricky part. The world around you will always try to sell you the idea that you're not enough yet, that you need to hurry, that if you stop for even a moment, someone else will pass you. And so the question becomes, will you live for the scoreboard, or will you live for your soul? Every morning you have a choice. You can wake up already chasing, or you can wake up arriving. You can measure your day by how much you squeezed into it, or by how deeply you experienced it. Presence is not about avoiding responsibility. It's about remembering that life is not a race to the finish line, because the finish line is the one place none of us are in a rush to get to. So today, I choose to drink my coffee slowly. I choose to look into someone's eyes and actually see them. I choose to walk without needing to run. I choose to listen to the rain without thinking about tomorrow's weather, because this moment right here is all I ever truly have. And if I miss it, I miss life. When you choose presence over pressure, you discover a different kind of power. The kind that doesn't come from controlling everything, but from being free, even in the middle of chaos. And when you live this way, something unexpected happens. Your joy stops depending on how the day goes, and starts flowing simply because you're here. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to loosen our grip. For years, I thought holding on meant being strong. I clung to relationships that had already served their purpose. I carried grudges like stones in my pocket. I obsessed over outcomes I couldn't control, believing that if I just tried harder, life would finally bend to my will. But life isn't a rope we can pull into place. It's a river. And rivers don't need pushing, forcing, or dragging. They flow exactly where they need to go. One day I realized my tight grasp was the very thing blocking life's flow. My attachments, my fears, my need to control, they were like a dam stopping the current. And the moment I started to release my hold, even just a little, I could feel the water begin to move again. Letting go isn't defeat. It's not giving up. It's saying to life, I trust you. It's allowing the natural intelligence of the universe to take the lead. In Buddhism, they call it non-attachment. Not indifference, not apathy, but a state of deep trust. You still care, but you don't cling. You still love, but you don't chain the person you love to your expectations. You still dream, but you're not shattered when reality takes a different turn. And something magical happens when you let go. Opportunities appear you never saw before, because you were too busy staring at the closed door to notice the open one. People who truly align with your path enter your life, because there's finally space for them. And your heart feels lighter because you're not dragging yesterday into today. There's a freedom that comes from realizing you don't need to manage every ripple in the water. You don't need to force every bend in the river to match your map. The river already knows the way. Of course, letting go isn't a one-time act. Some days I have to let go over and over again. Thoughts rise, emotions swell, and my hands instinctively tighten around the things I fear losing. And when I notice that grip, I take a breath and I loosen it once more. And every time I do, I remember life flows best when I stop trying to dam the current. As I learned to let go, something inside me began to change. The noise quieted. The tension in my chest eased. I began to notice the gentle rhythm of life, like a song I had been too busy to hear. It wasn't just about finding peace. It was about finally stepping into harmony with the way things truly are. And in that harmony, I discovered something I hadn't expected. There's a quiet strength that comes from simply watching. Not watching like a passive bystander, but watching with the eyes of someone who refuses to be pulled into the storm. Imagine this. Someone says something hurtful. Your old self might have fired back instantly, defending, explaining, or attacking. But now you just notice. You notice how the words enter your ears, how your mind quickly starts spinning stories, how your body tenses, and how your breath changes. You don't fight it. You don't feed it. You simply see it. That's when you realize the moment you stop reacting, the other person loses control over you. It's not that you're suppressing your emotions, you're simply not letting them drive the car anymore. The Buddha once taught that between a stimulus and your response, there's a space. In that space lies your freedom. And when you fill that space with awareness instead of reflex, you become untouchable. The world around you can still shout, judge, criticize, or provoke. But when you observe instead of react, those things lose their ability to shake you. They pass through like wind passing over a mountain. The mountain does not move. This doesn't mean you never take action. Observation is not inaction. It's a conscious choice to respond from clarity instead of chaos. When you see clearly, your words are sharper, kinder, and wiser. When you move from awareness, your actions carry weight without carrying anger. So next time life throws you a spark, don't throw gasoline on it. Just watch the spark. You'll be amazed how quickly it fades when it has nothing to feed on. And as you keep practicing this, something profound happens. You realize that peace was never about controlling the world. It was about controlling the way you meet it. Because the truth is, you can't stop the waves, but you can stop yourself from drowning in them. Imagine this. The first light of dawn spills gently across your room. The world is still quiet. No emails, no phone buzzing, no voices competing for your attention. Just you and the beginning of a brand new day. Most people rush into their mornings like they're jumping into a fast-moving river, swept away before they even realize where they are. But what if instead your morning became a sacred pause? Not just a routine, but a personal ritual. Something that doesn't just prepare you for the day, but anchors you in peace, clarity, and gratitude before the noise even begins. In Buddhism, mornings are seen as a mirror of the mind. The state you cultivate when you wake often sets the tone for everything that follows. If your first moments are scattered, the rest of the day tends to echo that chaos. But if your morning is intentional, rooted in awareness, the day becomes lighter, more spacious, more grounded. So, how do you transform something as ordinary as waking up into something sacred? It begins with attention. Not to your phone, not to your to-do list, but to your breath. Step 1. Before you even leave your bed, take a deep, slow inhale. Feel your chest rise, feel your lungs expand, and then let it go. Do this 3 times. This is your way of telling your mind, we start today with presence, not panic. Step 2. Offer gratitude silently, inwardly. Gratitude for the bed beneath you, for the fact that you woke up, for the chance to experience this one more day of life. It doesn't matter if your life is perfect right now, it never is. But gratitude is the soil in which peace can grow. Step 3. Create a small space, a corner, a cushion, a desk that's yours alone. Maybe it has a candle, maybe a small Buddha statue or an image that inspires you. Maybe just a simple flower in a vase. It doesn't need to be ornate. It just needs to hold meaning for you. When you sit there, your mind should know this is where we meet ourselves. Step 4. Choose a single simple practice. 5 minutes of meditation, a few pages from a book of wisdom, or even just sipping tea slowly without distraction. It's not about what you do, it's about how you do it with intention, with awareness. Your morning ritual is not a luxury. It's a lifeline. It's a reminder that you are not a prisoner of hurry, that you don't have to start the day already running. And here's the truth: if you claim the morning, you claim the day, because no one else can take from you what you've already rooted in peace. So tomorrow, when you wake, don't just get up, arrive. Let your first breath be sacred. Let your first thoughts be grateful, and let your first actions be deliberate. Because a peaceful morning isn't just the start of a better day, it's the start of a better life. When peace first touches your life, it can feel like a fragile flame, warm, gentle, but vulnerable to the slightest wind. A harsh word, a sudden problem, an unexpected change, they can all feel like storms that threaten to blow it out. That's why peace isn't just something we find once and hold forever. It's something we must nurture, protect, and strengthen over time. Think of peace as a muscle. You don't build strength in one workout and expect it to last a lifetime. You train it consistently, patiently, sometimes through small repetitions you barely notice. Every moment you choose patience over anger, compassion over judgment, gratitude over complaint, you are adding another layer to your inner fortress. And this fortress isn't built in grand, dramatic ways. It's built in the quiet, everyday choices, like when you choose to take a slow breath instead of snapping back in frustration, like when you turn off the noise and spend a few minutes just sitting in stillness, like when you listen deeply instead of waiting to speak. These moments seem small, almost invisible, but over the years, they accumulate into something unshakable. True perseverance in peace doesn't mean you never face challenges. It means that over time, challenges lose their power to control you. The waves still crash, but your ship no longer tips over. You might feel the wind, but it doesn't uproot you. And one day, without realizing it, you'll notice that what once disturbed you no longer even touches the surface of your mind. This is why those who dedicate themselves to nurturing peace often appear calm even in chaos. It's not because life is easier for them, it's because they've been practicing. Each trial became training. Each difficulty was a chance to strengthen their roots. They didn't see peace as a prize they won. They saw it as a garden they tended. And here's the beautiful truth: peace compounds. Just like a small investment grows over time, the peace you cultivate today will serve you tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. What begins as a fragile flame becomes an unshakable light, a light that not only guides you but quietly warms everyone around you. When you understand this, you stop rushing. You stop expecting instant transformation. You trust the process. You live with the quiet confidence that every choice you make toward peace is never wasted, even if it feels small. Because one day you'll look back and realize you've been building something far more powerful than you imagined. And it will be in that moment you understand. Peace was never just a feeling. It was a lifelong work of art. There's a quiet magic in the moment the day begins to dim. The air feels softer, the noise fades, and life itself seems to take a slow, steady breath. For some, this is the time to count what went wrong, to dwell on mistakes or missed chances. But for a peaceful mind, the end of the day is not a graveyard of regrets. It's the fertile soil where tomorrow's seeds are planted. When the sun sinks below the horizon, it's not announcing an ending. It's whispering, "Rest now, something new is on its way." Just like the moon doesn't fight the darkness, it glows through it, we too can choose to end each day not with frustration but with grace. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders. The words someone said, the things you couldn't finish, the worries that tried to own your thoughts, they don't belong to you anymore. They happened. They passed. And now they can go. Instead of replaying the day's noise, listen for the stillness underneath. That stillness is your real home. It's where your mind returns when it's done chasing the world. And if you nurture it, every ending, no matter how heavy, will turn into a doorway you can walk through calmly, barefoot, unafraid. Remember, nothing that happened today defines you. You are not your mistakes. You are not your successes either. You are the space in which they came and went. And that space is infinite. No matter how small your victories or how loud your failures, the new sunrise doesn't care, it shows up for you anyway. So tonight, as you lay your head down, treat it like a quiet ceremony. Breathe in slowly, and with every breath out, imagine you're releasing every tight knot inside you. Thank the day for what it gave, forgive it for what it took, and trust that tomorrow will bring what you truly need, maybe not what you want, but what your soul has been quietly asking for all along. In the soft darkness, feel the truth. Peace isn't found when the world finally stops moving. It's found when you stop trying to control it. And in that surrender, the night no longer feels like an ending. It feels like the gentle turning of a page. The day is done, but your story, your real story, is just beginning. If this journey touched something deep within you, if even one word today planted a seed of peace in your heart, then let that seed grow. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom and walk with us on this path of clarity, compassion, and awakening. Because the next step of the journey is waiting, and it begins with you.